Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and with me now is Sanjeev Kishan, the chairperson of PwC in India. Welcome, Sanjeev. You have just put out a very interesting report that is called a Viksit approach for India to achieve $1 trillion in exports. Why this report and why now? What's the crux of these suggestions?
So first of all, thank you, Siddharth, for having us. And yes, the report, we just thought it was appropriate to launch this report because we have been talking about Viksit Bharat. The Honorable Prime Minister has set the North Star for a developed India. And in doing that, I think one of the key things really has been the contribution that exports could make to the Indian GDP. Now, within that, we know that services exports is something that India is known for. I think we have done very well when it comes to GCCs, professional services. IT, of course, has been a standout. But it is really the focus on merchandise export, which has been a bit challenging. We do believe that with everything that has been done over the last many years, there is a lot of enablement which has been caused for India's merchandise export to now grow so that we can actually aspire for a $1 trillion number by 2029. India's merchandise exports have been growing by 14.4% in recent past. You know, they have been serially growing since the liberalization of 1991. But with so many things like the PLI, like the Make in India, and the large areas of enablement that have been caused with some of the other challenges that we have identified, if we address some of those challenges, and we create certain further enablements that we are seeking in the report, the framework, the Viksit framework as we are calling it, can pivot India to the 1 trillion aspiration of exports and merchandise, which would be a stepping stone to India's Viksit Bharat aspirations. And we thought no better time to release it just before India's Independence Day.
What are the key elements of this proposed approach?
So I think as I mentioned, Siddharth, I think the Viksit framework it's a framework. I mean, it's really a bunch of horizontals and verticals that we have identified. There are certain enablers. I think when we talk about the Viksit approach, and if I can take you through, I think the most important thing is that what's the kind of value addition and volumes that can cause us to be a 1 trillion. Historically, we have exported a lot of materials where the value add component has not been so extensive. Now, you know, everybody recognizes that when you talk about value addition, it could take a few years for that value addition to happen. But how do you enhance value addition? And that's where we have made certain recommendations. Then the focus on it, this growth has to be inclusive. You know, when we looked at the data and we picked up 3 sectors, we noticed that the contribution of the MSMEs, which is really the backbone of the industry or of the GDP of the GDP contribution, that has not been very extensive and it's not very inclusive. So we've made certain recommendations to make this growth inclusive. You know, the K stands for, I would say, knowledge, you know, because one of the biggest gaps that we have today is skilling. And, you know, in a world which is disrupted and we keep talking about technology and so on and so forth, I think it's very important that there is knowledge which is imparted to our workmen and others to make sure that we are able to reach that aspiration that we have. The S stands for sustainability. I think it's extremely important that, you know, today when, you know, there is a, you know, when we are dealing with something like CBAM, everybody wants to buy sustainable products. Whether in India or indeed outside, etc. Sustainability is a big disruptor. Our products have to be sustainable, you know, if they have to be competitive in the international markets. The I stands for some other infrastructure enablement and repairs that we need to make sure that all of this is smoothened out and the cost of factors of production continue to reduce and become more competitive. And of course, T stands for technology, and the way technology can continue to be a disruptor but an enabler to whether it is about, you know, industry IoT, or whether it is embedding more and more of technology on the shop floor, so that we are so that we are able to embrace technology and then use technology to create trust in what we produce, so that we can get value for what we do in India. So that's a Viksit framework that we have put together, which can pivot India to a 1 trillion export aspiration on the merchandise side.
Sanjeev, you know, given the geopolitical context that we are seeing a sort of change to the global trade order as we have known it for the last 2 or 3 decades, and deglobalization is the buzzword. How will this target of $1 trillion in exports be achieved given the geopolitical realities that we are likely to see?
That's a very fair question, Siddharth. And I would say three things. The first thing that, even the 14.5% growth that we have had over the last few years, that has been in a world which has been talking about deglobalization, whether it is West and whether it is the East, etc. I mean, it's been that. It's not. It's that it was not there the last few years. I think the second one really is the disruptions that the world is seeing at this point in time, and there are certain amount of investments that some nations have made. There are certain amount of enablement that the world has made, etc. And in some ways, it's a question of making yourself more and more indispensable to certain value chains and supply chains across the globe. And I think a lot of effort India has made over the last few years, which we can now harness in a way where we are not in an antagonistic situation with any trading bloc and so on and so forth. In fact, India has been doing a bunch of bilaterals. A lot of FTAs have been done by India. UAE, Australia, we are negotiating one with European Union and UK and others. And this, in a way, has enhanced the market size which is available to Indian exporters. So I think that's the second one that I would say. And the third one, which I would say, is that India's positioning. When we talk about disruption, and I've spoken of that many a times. When we spoke about the disruption that the world is facing, whether it's supply chain, whether it is energy, whether it is technology, whether it is demographics, where our dividend, the demographic dividend, is supposed to potentially, some people say, expire maybe in 2050. This is our time. This is our time when we need the fact that we have been pivotal to responding to the disruptions. I think we have the best enablers at this point in time to create that to use that for manufacturing with the geopolitical, I should say, scenario that you mentioned. India stands in a better situation. We all acknowledge that, because we're not part of any warring blocks, so to speak. We have good relations across the globe. The bilaterals that we have done, the fact that we are focusing on being a solution provider to all the disruptions, it gives me the confidence that in spite of the deglobalization wave, we will come off better.
In a deglobalized world, how is the China factor likely to play out and its impact on India's export ambitions of the kind that you are sketching out?
I think the big challenge there, Siddharth, and it's always a fair point. China always has been historically, over the years, been a big exporter, particularly in the mercantile side. The trade deficit that many nations have is an example of that. I think there are, again, two reasons. One, of course, when you speak about value chains, etc. People don't necessarily need to be dependent on any specific country, whether it is a country that you mentioned or any other. I think it is about diversifying, whether it is near-shoring, friend-shoring, or whatever else that I'm, tactically using those words, near-shoring and friend-shoring. I think it's important that people have some diversification so that there is not over-dependence. And part of the whole deglobalization focus is to also make sure that there is not over-dependence on a particular player or a region or a geography to do that. And I think that creates an opportunity for India. The question, of course, for India is going to be that can we be competitive? Because, if you know that there are certain things which are available, including which are important and critical to you at a particular price point, can we be competitive, and can we do those things at scale and with the precision which is done elsewhere? And I think that's a challenge. But otherwise, to my mind, the fact that the world wants solutions and alternates will enable India to sort of, fight this perception that you mentioned about the compete that we might have. I think the other piece really, which I think is extremely important, and I think that comes into how do we embrace and in some ways mobilize everything that we have done, whether it is the policy framework that we have set up, whether it is the investment that we have made in terms of reducing our logistics costs and so on and so forth, the Gati Shakti framework, the enablement that we have done on the on the logistics side, and this competitive federalism that we have, because a lot of what we have said in our report will also apply to the states. I think there has to be a sync in between the central government and the state governments, because a lot of them, the application of all this has to be done at the state level for us to be competitive. And we believe that if we can enable that to happen, we will be able to compete even commercially quite well with the with, with the country that you mentioned and many others.
Sanjeev, IT-enabled services and their exports have accounted for a good chunk of our current exports. So have sectors like textiles, automobiles, and other products. A future of $1 trillion exports, what kind of composition of the trade basket will it have? Which sectors are likely to drive this kind of export growth?
So I think the framework that we have provided, we haven't sort of called out specific industries, though I must say that electronics, automobile, and food processing are the one that we did deep work on, because we do believe that the potential that these sectors bear for meeting our 1 trillion aspiration are very, very significant. We are already have certain advantages when it comes to on the automobile sector. I think we are very well regarded, but I think we can scale up certainly in a very significant way. I think we do believe that food processing is one area where India has some tactical strengths, and I think we can harness them far, far more. And with all the investments that we are making, whether it is in the alternative energy areas or in semiconductors and others, I think us playing a bigger role in the electronics value chain is something that will also be possible. With all these investments that we are making, which will be on stream in the next 2.5 to 3 years, I think it will cause the significant jump that we are all hoping can happen. But let me just say, Siddharth, that it is not just these three sectors. This framework could apply equally well to some of the other segments. So, for instance, we think about pharmaceutical, and we have always been a pharma basket to the world, right? I think the challenge, of course, was on the API side, and with the significant enablement that's happened on the PLI side, for instance, so that those API get manufactured in the country. I think there is ability in for India in each of those sectors with certain amount of enablement and upskilling and others that we have suggested to actually contribute significantly. But yes, these three sectors we have picked up specifically, and we do believe that those will be significant contributors to the 1 trillion aspiration.
Since you spoke about manufacturing, how do you see the manufacturing versus services and the debate that centers around investments to boost manufacturing, and whether that is correct or not?
Yeah, I've I've heard that debate, and it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one on it could always be an economic discussion that should you focus on something which is your strength and do more of it, or should you focus on something which where you're not doing as well, but try and sort of do it well. I think it has to be a balance. To my mind, it has to be a balance. I think from an employment generation standpoint, the services space has done really well, and you can see the growth that we have had on the GCC side, on the IT side, professional services side. I think all of that is there, but this growth needs to be inclusive. As I mentioned, the contribution of the MSMEs to India's export and India's GDP needs to be significant. There are so many MSMEs, that I tell you, there are almost 70,000 who actually export less than a crore. And it was when we went into in some detail, it was disappointing. I mean, I must say that it was a revelation for me as well. And for India's growth to be inclusive, I think we have no option but to make sure that the manufacturing sector is indeed encouraged, and that's where we have suggested some amount of almost an export promotion council, which actually helps the MSMEs, etc. Many of them get at times it's mind-boggling for them to deal with whatever it takes to sort of export stuff. Maybe they have the right intent, they have the right products, etc. But it's just mind-boggling for them to deal with the with the bureaucracy around exports, etc. And I think that's something which possibly needs to be unshackled, because unless the MSMEs and the backbone of the country contributes, it is not going to be inclusive. And they also need capital in a very significant way. They also need technology in a very significant way, because what they are lacking today is not the intent and the entrepreneurship ability, but maybe some amount of capital, maybe a certain amount of enablement and technology which they can comprehend and leverage for moving that 1 crore to, let's say, a 5 crore per MSME, and then we see the magic.
18 to 20 years ago, special economic zones were supposed to be key export drivers. The government chose to forego revenue and provide significant breaks in that context to companies who were operating out of special economic zones. That story went its own way. The second wave has been investments by the government in PLIs. The question I'm posing to you, is there a third approach or a third solution that needs to be added to the mix by the government to boost exports from India?
Well, I think both. I think both the schemes that you mentioned, I think including the SEZ, the PLI, etc., they have some very remarkable features, and it's a question of how do you continue to evolve, and some of the schemes that have come in. So, for instance, and I'm just not trying to critique anything, but specifically say about what can enable, right? So if there is, let's say a large area or geographic area has been identified, which can be a significant enabler to our manufacturing growth. Could be automobiles, could be electronics, and so on and so forth. If there is inclusion of the private sector right from day, as opposed to setting up a zone and then getting them to embrace that zone, that creates certain amount of incremental ownership, if I may call it so. It creates incremental ownership for the private sector, and it also means that the public sector and the private sector work much more in sync to what is needed for getting the exports done, etc., or the manufacturing done, etc., etc. Now, whether it is creating the right kind of warehousing so that you have the right kind of logistical support, whether it is to make sure that you have the right kind of enablement for workmen, which might mean that there has to be a certain amount of enablement for from a labor perspective, that there is labor at hand and they don't have to travel, let's say, 3 hours to get to their home, and come back from their homes, etc., and be more productive. I think that it has to be a little bit, all we are suggesting is a little bit more public private partnership, both in terms of thinking and conceptualizing, as some of these fiscal giveaways are given, because that will be a better value for some of the incentives that are given. And in a way, for instance, what we have suggested almost is like a gift city kind of enablement for the manufacturing sector. And it doesn't need to have the same kind of fiscal giveaways which some of the earlier scheme have had, but maybe involvement of the private sector, for instance, from the very start, can actually enable a lot of this to be a bit different than just get the better of some of the other schemes, and get a little bit more enablement and partnerships, and that will cause for much better outcomes.
One final question, Sanjeev, and this is to uh, ask you about what's the role of overseas investments in this kind of an export strategy, according to you?
I think that's a big question, Siddharth. I must say that when you talk about capital, and of course I add technology to it, those are the two always big enablers. Now, when we talk about capital, I think there are two areas. I think there has been a lot of private capital which has been coming into India over the last many years. We have seen huge amount of private credit flows that have been coming in. I think as some of these areas become more critical, I think one of the areas to me is going to be domestic capital. I think domestic capital flows, while there are a lot of foreign capital flows have been high, we need to make sure that domestic capital flows also are very high. There is significant domestic capital formation which has been happening, as a lot of Indian family offices and others start investing, but we need to create encouragement for them to be investing back in some of these areas, and contribute to nation building. I think one other area which I would also talk about is what kind of financing is available for there's a lot of financing still available for operating assets, but how do you enable capital availability for assets which are not in production yet, which are basically at the conceptualization stage and others, and also green financing, because one of the things which you typically expect that to enable and encourage green financing, you would look at certain amount of incentivization, where potentially by that being lower cost, etc., etc. I think some of that is needed as we think about crafting this aspiration, whether it is by way of maybe easier terms with your exporters, whether it is by way of on imports that you do better terms on those, etc. I think some of those would be, or indeed working capital on green sustainable products. I think some of those would continue to be needed, but I'm pretty sanguine that with the growth in the domestic capital formation in the country, with the amount of domestic capital which is available, and the banks sitting on healthier balance sheets than ever, this would be possible. Capital will be available for India's merchandise export aspirations.
Absolutely. Sanjeev, thank you very much for taking out the time to explain the PwC India Viksit approach for achieving $1 trillion in exports. Viksit Bharat and target for 2047 that has been set by the Government of India. Clearly, a lot needs to be done to actually get there. Once again, thank you very much for your time. With that, it's a wrap on this conversation. Viewers, we'll be back with more on Easynomics. Until then, goodbye.